There's something quietly fascinating about Jane Seymour. Of all of Henry VIII's 6 wives, she tends to get the least attention. Anne Boleyn gets the drama. Katherine of Aragon gets the sympathy. But Jane, she's usually the one standing somewhere in the middle, described as meek, plain, and obedient. And yet, when you actually look at her story closely, what you find is far more interesting and complicated than that simple picture suggests. So let's go back to the beginning. Jane was born at Wolfhall, her family's country estate in Wiltshire, somewhere between October 1507 and October 1508. The fact that we don't even know her exact birthday tells you something. She was the eldest surviving daughter, after several brothers, some of whom died young in Tudor England. The birth of a girl just wasn't considered an event worth writing down with any precision, especially not in a family that wasn't particularly grand. Her father, Sir John Seymour, was a man of respectable standing, but no real glamour. The Seymours had managed Savernake Forest in Wiltshire for generations, and Sir John served as local sheriff and justice of the peace. His estate covered around 1,200 acres, which sounds impressive until you measure it against the actual Tudor nobility, who operated on an entirely different level of wealth and influence. The kindest way to describe where the Seymours sat in the social order of Tudor England is probably country gentry. Solid, decent, but nowhere near the top. Sir John had one thing going for him that money couldn't easily buy, though. He had fought alongside Henry VIII in France in 1513 and 1514, and the young king had noticed his bravery and loyalty. That royal goodwill was worth a lot. It gave Sir John a measure of social standing that his income alone wouldn't have provided. Jane's mother, Lady Margaret Wentworth, brought something even more valuable to the family: bloodlines. She was a descendant of Edward III, which meant that despite the modest circumstances of Wolfhall, there was genuine aristocratic heritage running through her veins. She was, by most accounts, a quiet, kind, and gentle woman. Several of Jane's biographers have suggested that Jane's own famous softness of character came directly from her mother. Together, Sir John and Lady Marjorie had 10 children. 6 of them survived to adulthood. Among the sons, 2 would go on to become genuinely powerful figures in Tudor England: Edward Seymour, the eldest, and Thomas Seymour, the 3rd son. Both climbed steadily through the ranks during Henry's reign. Their father invested heavily in their futures, pushing them into military and political careers in the king's service. Jane's future, by contrast, was mapped out along much simpler lines. She was not considered a noble lady. The word gentlewoman was probably the highest label that could fairly be attached to her, given that her education reflected her station. She learned to read in English and could sign her name, though historians aren't entirely sure how well developed her writing skills actually were. She picked up a little French and had some very basic exposure to Latin, but that seems to have been the limit of her formal academic training. She did learn to dance, and she absorbed the social etiquette expected of a polite young woman in her circle. She was said to be a skilled horsewoman who genuinely loved the hunt, but the real focus of her upbringing was something far more practical: preparing her to run a household. Jane would have been trained in everything that came with managing a home of considerable size: caring for the family, organizing meals, acting as hostess, and supervising the servants who kept the estate functioning. And because the Seymours weren't wealthy enough to belong to the true leisure class, it's quite possible that Jane and her sisters did more than just supervise. They may have actually rolled up their sleeves and done some of that domestic work themselves. English noble women of the period didn't put their hands to household tasks, but the Seymour girls may well have cooked or cleaned. What we know for certain is that Jane excelled at sewing and embroidery, so much so that samples of her needlework were reportedly still on display at Hampton Court Palace, a full century and a half after her death. Those surviving tapestries were eventually gifted to the Seymour family's descendants in the 1650s. That's a remarkable legacy for someone who has often been described as plain and unremarkable. Religion also played a major role in shaping who Jane became. Her parents were devout Catholics, as was the majority of England before Henry's break with Rome. The Seymours kept a priest in permanent residence at Wolfhall right up until the 1530s. Jane's deep attachment to Catholicism and the sympathy she would later show toward persecuted Catholics during Henry's Reformation clearly had roots in the faith she was raised with from childhood. Now, what did Jane actually look like? We have Hans Holbein's portrait of her, painted in 1536, and most historians believe it's a reasonably accurate likeness. It shows a woman with a round face, a pointed and somewhat pinched chin, thin lips, and a prominent nose. Contemporary descriptions mention very pale skin, grayish-blue eyes, and golden or strawberry blonde hair. More than one person who knew her suggested she was plain rather than beautiful, and at least one of her biographers has pointed out, perhaps a little bluntly, that she remained unmarried into her late 20s, which was considered quite late for a Tudor woman. That last detail matters more than it might seem. In Tudor England, a woman's marriage prospects depended heavily on two things: her looks and her dowry. Jane's parents simply couldn't afford much in the way of dowries for their daughters. The cost of educating their sons and launching those sons into political and military careers had taken up most of what they had. Without a solid dowry, a woman needed to at least be pretty to attract a decent husband. Jane's younger sister Elizabeth, who apparently inherited their mother's reportedly striking good looks, was married off in her mid-teens to an ambitious young knight. Jane didn't have that same advantage working in her favor. There had been some talk in the mid-1520s of a potential match between Jane and William Dormer, son of Sir Robert Dormer, but the Dormer family kept stalling over the dowry issue, and nothing ever came of it. Jane remained unmarried and at home, her prospects looking increasingly modest. Then something shifted. At around 19 years old, Jane managed to secure a place as a lady-in-waiting to Queen Katherine of Aragon. This happened through the influence of her cousin by marriage, a courtier named Sir Francis Bryan. The thinking behind sending Jane to court was fairly straightforward. Being in the Queen's household put her in front of people who could help arrange a better marriage than she could find in Wiltshire. Nobody at that point was imagining anything grander than a respectable match with some minor courtier or knight. The idea that quiet, plain, modest Jane Seymour might one day be Queen of England would have struck anyone as completely absurd. Jane arrived at Greenwich Palace sometime around early 1526. As it happened, this was roughly the same time that Anne Boleyn returned from France to take up her own position as a lady-in-waiting to Queen Katherine. So both women entered the Queen's household at around the same period, though their personalities and circumstances could hardly have been more different. For the next 5 years, Jane watched everything unfold around her. She saw Henry's growing obsession with Anne Boleyn. She witnessed the slow, painful unraveling of Catherine's marriage to the king. She watched a queen lose her husband's love and eventually her crown. And through all of it, Jane kept her thoughts almost entirely to herself. Her devotion to Queen Katherine grew stronger the longer she served her. The same was true of her affection for Catherine's daughter, Princess Mary. Both relationships would prove important later in Jane's story, but at this stage, what matters most is the discipline Jane showed in keeping her opinions private. She clearly did not approve of what was happening to Katherine, and she almost certainly had complicated feelings about Anne Boleyn. Yet she was discreet enough to show none of it openly, and that discretion had a very practical consequence. When Anne became queen, she kept Jane on as one of her ladies-in-waiting. If Jane had shown any visible hostility or disapproval, Anne would never have tolerated her presence. Jane spent 2 years serving in Anne Boleyn's household. Throughout most of that time, there is no evidence that Anne had any complaint about her conduct or her attitude. And this tells us something genuinely interesting about the woman history has often reduced to a passive, gentle figure. Beneath the quiet exterior, Jane Seymour was clearly someone who kept her own counsel very carefully. She had opinions she didn't share, feelings she didn't display, and ambitions she didn't advertise. The woman most people probably dismissed as a harmless, obliging presence in the background was watching, waiting, and playing a much longer game than anyone around her seems to have realized. Nobody knows exactly when Henry's interest in Jane shifted from casual awareness to something more deliberate and personal. By January of 1536, they were clearly quite taken with each other, but the attraction may well have started earlier. Queen Anne had become pregnant for the last time in October of 1535. Since sex during pregnancy was widely believed to endanger the child, Henry's famously wandering attention may have drifted toward Jane as early as November of that year. There were even whispers at court that Henry had been pursuing yet another mistress entirely, a woman whose name has never been recorded, mentioned in several sources from 1534. Less than a year into his marriage to Anne. The 29th of January 1536 is one of those dates that sits at the center of everything. It was the day Katherine of Aragon was buried, and according to the imperial ambassador Eustace Chapuis, it was also the day he personally observed Henry paying what he described as marked attention to Jane Seymour and giving her gifts. Later that same afternoon, a story circulated that Queen Anne had walked in on a private moment between Henry and Jane, finding one of her own ladies-in-waiting sitting on the king's knee. Anne reportedly flew into a rage. Henry, worried that her distress might harm the pregnancy, quickly ushered Jane out of the room and tried to calm his wife down. This particular account comes from Jane Dormer, the Duchess of Ferrier, who claimed to have heard it during her later service as a lady-in-waiting to Queen Mary I. Since it was recorded long after the fact, historians treat it with some caution, but what happened next is not in dispute. Sometime around the end of January, possibly that very night, Anne Boleyn miscarried her last child. On that same day, Ambassador Chapuis wrote a letter to the Imperial Foreign Minister describing a secret meeting he had attended with Thomas Cromwell, Henry's chief minister. Cromwell had quietly communicated the king's desire to renew his political alliance with Emperor Charles V. But Cromwell had also shared something more personal. He told Chapuis about a private conversation he had held with Henry earlier that day, during which the king had apparently confided that he believed his marriage to Anne had been brought about by witchcraft. On those grounds, he considered the marriage invalid, and he had made up his mind to take another wife. Whether Henry genuinely believed in witchcraft or was simply looking for a convenient justification is a question historians still debate. What matters is that by the end of January 1536, Henry had mentally moved on from Anne Boleyn, and Jane Seymour was already in the picture. The final months of Jane's service in Anne's household must have been extraordinarily tense for everyone involved. Henry was not being particularly subtle in his pursuit of Jane, and Anne still had formal authority over her as her mistress and queen. Anne knew her position was weakening, and it made her volatile and anxious. She was said to have slapped Jane on more than one occasion, either for genuine insolence or simply because she was watching Jane's every move and interpreting anything she did as a provocation. One story in particular presents a very different image of Jane from the docile, self-effacing one she usually projects. At some point in February or March of 1536, Henry reportedly gave Jane a gold locket containing a miniature portrait of himself. According to the account, Jane made a point of opening and closing the locket conspicuously in front of the Queen. Anne, enraged, reached out and ripped it from Jane's neck so forcefully that she cut her own finger in the process. If that story is accurate, then Jane was not simply the passive recipient of Henry's affection. She was actively needling her mistress. Whether that reflects genuine confidence, cold calculation, or simply the behavior of someone who knew the game was already won and couldn't resist showing it, is difficult to say. What is clear is that Anne didn't dare dismiss Jane from her service. She was too afraid of provoking Henry's anger at a moment when she was already losing his favor. Her power was draining away, and she knew it. By contrast, Jane's conscience appeared completely undisturbed. Traditionally, Jane Seymour has been portrayed as gentle, compassionate, and almost saintly. Some of that impression almost certainly came from her real behavior and manner, which left most of her contemporaries with a consistent picture of a quiet and submissive woman. But it stretches the imagination to suppose that anyone could move through those circumstances without judgment, resentment, or at least some measure of cold satisfaction. Jane quite possibly had very little sympathy for Anne Boleyn. By 1536, a growing number of courtiers shared that view. Anne had become increasingly difficult to serve and to please as her anxiety mounted. She had made powerful enemies among the political players at Henry's court, people who blamed her for the king's religious reforms and who viewed her attempts to influence royal policy with deep suspicion and hostility. For Jane, though, the resentment may have been more personal and more principled. She was a committed Catholic. She had loved and admired Katherine of Aragon. She had watched Princess Mary be stripped of her title and treated as illegitimate. Anne Boleyn had been at the center of all of that. Jane's feelings about Anne were probably shaped less by courtly politics and more by genuine religious conviction and personal loyalty to the women Anne had displaced. The picture that emerges is not of a saint stepping in to rescue Henry from a bad marriage. It's of a human being with her own beliefs, her own grievances, and her own ambitions, who found herself in a position to act on all three at once. There's a question that historians keep coming back to when they look at this period, and it's worth sitting with for a moment. Did the romance between Henry and Jane develop naturally, or was it engineered by the people around them? Because there was a group of very powerful courtiers who desperately wanted Anne Boleyn gone. They had different reasons. Some were motivated by religion, wanting to halt the Protestant reforms that Anne had championed and that were reshaping England in ways they found deeply troubling. Others had personal grievances against Anne. Others still were driven by political calculations about the succession and England's relationship with the Catholic powers of Europe. The group included the Marquess and Marchioness of Exeter, the Duke of Suffolk, Sir Nicholas Carew, Thomas Cromwell, Sir Francis Bryan, and the Imperial Ambassador Chapuis himself. It is entirely possible that this faction saw in Jane Seymour exactly what they needed: a quiet, Catholic, malleable young woman who might catch the king's eye and give them a lever to use against Anne. If they did help engineer the affair, they would almost certainly have coached Jane on Henry's preferences, his moods, his vanities, and the best way to hold his attention without overplaying her hand. Her own family would have been equally enthusiastic. The prospect of Jane becoming queen would have been almost unimaginable to the Seymours just a few years earlier. Now, it was a real possibility, and they would have done everything they could to help it along. On the other hand, it's also possible that Henry noticed Jane on his own, and that the conspirators only moved in afterward to take advantage of something that had already started, Jane doesn't come across as someone who would have initiated a flirtation with the king of her own accord. So perhaps Henry made the first move, and the anti-Anne faction simply recognized an opportunity and began working to shape it in their favor. Either way, what happened next is one of the more fascinating moments in Jane's story. Sometime in February of 1536, Henry sent Sir Nicholas Carew to Jane, carrying a love letter and a small purse heavy with gold coins. What Jane did next was either a remarkable display of genuine virtue or one of the most calculated moves in Tudor courtship history, depending on how you read it. Sir Nicholas later reported back to the king that Jane had refused to accept either the letter or the purse. She had held the letter briefly, pressed a respectful kiss to its seal, and handed it back without opening it. She returned the gold as well. On her knees before Sir Nicholas, she asked him to convey her thanks to the king, along with her explanation that she was a woman of good and moral upbringing who would rather suffer 1,000 deaths than sacrifice her honor. She thanked Henry for his generosity, but requested that he keep the gift until she had contracted an honorable marriage. It's a striking moment. But here's the thing that makes several historians raise an eyebrow. Jane had already been accepting expensive gifts from Henry for months before this, so why did her scruples suddenly resurface at precisely this moment? The answer, at least to some historians, is fairly obvious. Jane was following Anne Boleyn's own strategy almost to the letter. Anne had done exactly the same thing years earlier, responding to Henry's advances while firmly refusing to become his mistress, thereby maneuvering him into the position where marriage was the only way forward. It had worked spectacularly for Anne, and now Jane was doing it too. Henry's response to Jane's refusal was telling. He declared that she had behaved most modestly, and he resolved from that point on to court her only in the presence of one or more of her relatives, to protect her reputation. He then promptly moved Thomas Cromwell out of the royal chambers that adjoined his own and gave those rooms to Jane's brother Edward. This gave Henry and Jane a place to meet that was private enough for courtship, but properly chaperoned enough to keep scandal at bay. By early March, though, gossip about the affair had already started spreading through London. There was actually some public sympathy for Anne at this point, the Queen, who was visibly losing her husband's favour. Henry had effectively abandoned her at Greenwich Palace by the end of February, relocating himself to York Place in London and continuing to court Jane quietly throughout March. By the 1st of April, word of their meetings in Edward Seymour's chambers had spread more widely at court. Henry then moved Jane out of Greenwich entirely, placing her in a royal residence in Chelsea, a short distance along the Thames from where he was staying. The official reason may have been protecting her reputation, but the more likely reason was keeping her away from what was already happening at court: the active campaign to charge Anne Boleyn with capital crimes and remove her permanently. Jane almost certainly knew that something serious and final was being set in motion. She may not have known every detail, but she would have understood the direction things were heading. And yet, by every account we have, she responded to the news of Anne's imminent execution with her characteristic quiet composure. Henry visited Jane on the very morning of Anne's execution to comfort her and to assure her that they would be married very soon. The day after Anne Boleyn was executed, Henry and Jane were officially betrothed. Less than 2 weeks later, on the 30th of May 1536, they were married in a small, semi-private ceremony in the Queen's Closet at Whitehall. The officiating bishop was Stephen Gardiner, a religiously conservative figure whose presence at the ceremony was itself a kind of signal about the direction Jane hoped England might take. One historian put it plainly: Jane stepped neatly over the body of her rival, and straight onto the throne beside Henry. It's an uncomfortable image, but it's an honest one, and it mirrors almost exactly what Anne had done to Catherine of Aragon years before. The difference is that history has tended to judge Anne harshly for it, while giving Jane a much gentler treatment. Whether that's fair is a question worth sitting with. What Jane chose as her royal emblem as queen tells you something about how she wanted to present herself, and perhaps about what she genuinely believed her role to be. Anne Boleyn's emblem had featured a crowned falcon with the motto, "The Most Happy." Jane chose a crowned phoenix with the motto, "Bound to obey and serve." The message was carefully constructed. Through faith, obedience, and service, as Henry's wife, England would rise renewed from the chaos and upheaval that the king's divorce had caused. It was a direct contrast to everything Anne had represented, and it was clearly intentional. Among those watching Jane's arrival on the throne with the greatest optimism was Eustace Chapuis, the imperial ambassador. He wrote to Emperor Charles V, assuring him that he would encourage the new queen to keep working toward the restoration of Lady Mary, both to Henry's favor and to the line of succession. Jane herself confirmed to Chapuis in a subsequent conversation that she intended to show kindness to Mary and to work toward reconciling her with her father. Henry moved quickly to shut that conversation down. He was uncomfortable with the idea of his new queen acting, even indirectly, as a channel for the emperor's political interests, and he had good reason to be wary. Ensuring that a Catholic heir inherited the English throne was one of Charles V's central foreign policy goals throughout this entire period. If Henry and Jane's marriage produced no male heir, then Lady Mary's chances of taking the throne improved considerably with the Queen's active support. As Queen, Jane did genuinely advocate for Mary. She had actually asked Henry to reinstate Mary as his heir even before they were married. Henry had responded with gentle dismissiveness, suggesting that Jane ought to focus instead on advocating for the children she would have with him. It was a polite brush-off, but the message was clear enough. Jane's attempts to influence Henry's broader decisions met with diminishing patience from him as time went on. Those at court, who had hoped Jane might prove more successful at steering the king's policies than either Catherine or Anne had been, were largely disappointed. Henry refused to reconcile with Mary unless she met a very specific and humiliating set of conditions. She had to repudiate the Pope, acknowledge Henry as head of the Church of England, affirm that her parents' marriage had been invalid, and admit her own illegitimacy. Through Thomas Cromwell, Henry even threatened Mary with charges of treason and a potential death sentence if she refused to comply. Despite her failure to move Henry on the big political and religious questions, Jane's personal conduct toward Mary was warm and consistent. She spent a great deal of time with her stepdaughter at court, treated her generously, and continued pressing Henry to restore her to the succession. This matters because once Jane was securely on the throne, there was really nothing forcing her to keep pushing a pro-Catholic, pro-Mary agenda, except her own genuine convictions. She had already won. She had no obvious reason to keep taking the risk of irritating Henry unless she actually believed in what she was doing. The same sincerity, however, did not appear to extend to Henry's younger daughter, the not yet 4-year-old Princess Elizabeth. Jane showed no hesitation in embracing Mary as a stepdaughter and companion, but she kept Elizabeth at arm's length. There are a few possible explanations for this. Engaging warmly with Elizabeth meant engaging with the memory of Anne Boleyn, and Henry might well have reacted badly to any reference to his executed wife. Jane's own feelings about Anne may also have made it difficult for her to look at Anne's child with genuine warmth. Whatever the reason, Elizabeth's household deteriorated badly in the months following her mother's death. Within 6 months, The servants and caretakers responsible for Elizabeth's welfare were reportedly poaching game just to keep the household fed, and no one seemed troubled by the fact that the child had outgrown all of her clothes with no means to replace them. It was actually Mary who stepped in to advocate for her younger sister, a sister she had resented having to serve, but felt compassion for as a child too young to understand what had happened to her world. Mary may have done more to bring Elizabeth back into Henry's favor than Jane ever did. Jane did pick her battles though, and when she chose to push back against Henry, she did so on the issues that mattered most to her personally. During the year following her marriage, she made several attempts to persuade Henry to slow down the Protestant reforms that were reshaping England. The most dramatic of these moments came during the uprising known as the Pilgrimage of Grace, when tens of thousands of people across the north of England rose in rebellion, driven largely by their anger at the dissolution of the monasteries. These were communities that had served as centers of religious life, education, and charity for centuries, and Henry's government was systematically stripping and closing them down. Jane got down on her knees before Henry and begged him to stop. She pleaded for the monasteries to be restored and for mercy to be shown to those who were struggling to accept the changes being forced upon them. Henry's response was cold and direct. He reminded Jane of what had happened to Anne Boleyn. It was not a subtle warning. He was telling his new queen that interfering in matters of state and religion was dangerous ground, and that no wife of his was beyond the consequences of pushing too far. Jane apparently took the warning to heart and pulled back. She was not foolish enough to keep pressing after a warning like that. This moment is worth pausing on, because it complicates the picture of Jane as simply a passive and obedient figure. A truly passive woman wouldn't have knelt before the king and begged him to reverse course on one of the defining policies of his reign. Jane had genuine convictions, and she acted on them, even when doing so carried real personal risk. She just also knew when to stop. By early 1537, Jane was pregnant. The news transformed the atmosphere at court. Henry was jubilant in a way that went beyond ordinary happiness. This was what everything had been building toward. Every divorce, every execution, every rupture with Rome, every political crisis of the previous decade had been driven, at least in part, by Henry's desperate need for a legitimate male heir. And now, finally, it seemed that need might actually be met. Henry threw himself into planning. He arranged for a ceremonial 2,000-gun salute to mark the birth. He ordered Te Deums to be sung in every church across England. He planned for free food and wine to be distributed to the people in celebration. And he began organizing what he intended to be one of the most spectacular coronation ceremonies ever staged for an English queen. Jane had not yet been officially crowned, and Henry wanted her coronation to be extraordinary. Throughout the pregnancy, Jane seemed content and in generally good health. She experienced the usual cravings, most notably for quail and quail's eggs, which Henry made sure were supplied to her in generous quantities. The months passed without serious alarm, and as the expected delivery date approached, the court held its breath with cautious optimism. Jane entered her formal confinement in early September of 1537, roughly a month before the baby was due. This was standard practice for a queen approaching the end of pregnancy. She was attended by a small number of women permitted to be present during the late stages, including the now 21-year-old Lady Mary, whose presence beside her stepmother in those final weeks says something about the genuine warmth of the relationship they had built. Jane went into labor on the 9th of October. Henry, receiving the news, immediately ordered everything into motion. The preparations for celebration began, and then the hours started passing without resolution. A full day went by, then another, the labor continued without a safe delivery. The atmosphere, which had begun with such excitement, grew tense and then frightening. Everyone at court understood what prolonged labor meant in the 16th century. Medical knowledge was limited, interventions were crude and dangerous, and the mortality rate for both mothers and infants in difficult deliveries was devastating. Finally, at 2 o'clock in the morning on the 12th of October 1537, after more than 2 days of labor, Jane gave birth to a boy. He was healthy. He was Henry's longed-for son and heir, the future Edward VI of England. The celebrations that Henry had planned erupted across the country. The bonfires were lit, the guns fired, the churches rang with Te Deums. After decades of anxiety and upheaval, the King of England finally had his son. Jane was exhausted and visibly drained in the days that followed. She rested and recovered slowly. By the time she was churched, the traditional ceremony of purification that marked the formal end of confinement, she appeared weak and unusually pale, even by her own standards. But a week had passed since the birth, and most of the court considered the worst to be behind them. The Queen had delivered a healthy child and survived. Surely the rest was simply a matter of rest and recovery. Then, on the 17th of October, everything changed. Jane developed a raging fever and slipped into delirium. Over the following week, Jane rallied twice. There were brief moments where she regained consciousness and appeared to be making small improvements, enough to give those around her flickering hope that she might pull through. But those improvements didn't hold. Each time she seemed to stabilize, the fever returned and pulled her back under. Jane Seymour died quietly on the 24th of October 1537. She was 29 years old. She had been Queen of England for just over a year, and she had never been officially crowned. The cause of her death has been debated ever since. Historians from the 18th through to the 20th century generally concluded that she died of puerperal fever, also known as childbed fever, an infection contracted during delivery, most likely from unsterilized instruments or hands. In the 16th century, nobody understood germ theory or the importance of hygiene in medical procedures, and infections picked up during childbirth killed enormous numbers of women across every level of society. But there is another strand of accounts, written by people who were actually present or close to the events, that tells a more troubling story. Multiple contemporary sources claim that Jane did not simply die of infection following a difficult birth. They claim she underwent surgery during labor, specifically a cesarean section. Here is what those accounts describe. By the morning of the 11th of October, after more than a day of labor without a safe delivery, the midwives and physicians attending the Queen had begun to lose confidence that things would resolve safely on their own. At least one of them apparently approached Henry with a question that no husband ever wants to be asked. If it came down to a choice between saving the mother or saving the child, which did he want them to prioritize? Some sources say Henry chose Jane, others say he chose the child. The accounts contradict each other, and neither version can be fully verified. What the physicians were essentially asking was whether Henry would permit a cesarean section to be performed on the Queen if the child's survival depended on it. Cesarean sections were not unknown in Tudor England, but they carried an almost certain death sentence for the mother. They were therefore considered acceptable only in cases where the mother had already died during childbirth, to attempt to save the child. Performing one on a living woman was a drastically different and deeply taboo proposition. Later historians tended to dismiss these accounts as Catholic propaganda designed to damage Henry's reputation, suggesting that the story of Henry choosing to sacrifice his wife for the sake of an heir was invented by his enemies. But the problem with that dismissal is that some of the sources making these claims were written by Protestant reformers, not Catholic opponents of the king. And some accounts even suggest that Jane herself gave her consent to the procedure. We will probably never know with certainty exactly what happened in that birthing chamber. What we can say, based on the symptoms described during Jane's final illness, is that she almost certainly died of sepsis, arising from an infection sustained during childbirth. Whether that infection resulted from a natural delivery gone wrong or from a surgical intervention is a question the historical record cannot definitively answer. What we do know is how Henry responded to her death. He was, by all accounts, genuinely devastated. He withdrew from public life and went into deep mourning. Jane was given a magnificent funeral, fitting for a Queen of England, despite the fact that she had never formally been crowned. Henry requested, and this is perhaps the most telling detail of all, that when his own time came, he be buried beside her. That wish was eventually granted. Henry VIII and Jane Seymour lie together at Windsor Castle. The portrait known as the Family of Henry VIII, painted during his later marriage to Catherine Parr, shows Henry surrounded by his children. But the woman standing in the place reserved for the King's Queen is not Catherine Parr, his wife at the time the portrait was commissioned. It is Jane Seymour. Henry chose to be depicted for posterity alongside the wife who had given him his son, not the one he was actually married to. These gestures have led many historians to conclude that Jane was Henry's favorite wife, the one he loved most truly and most deeply. But others have asked a more uncomfortable question. Was it really love, or was it something more complicated? Jane died before Henry's feelings for her had any chance to curdle. Every other long relationship Henry had with a woman eventually went sour. Catherine of Aragon held on for decades before he turned against her. Anne Boleyn went from the great passion of his life to a woman he sent to the block. His later marriages were shorter and less emotionally intense, but even those ended badly or unsatisfyingly. Jane alone escaped that pattern, simply because she died too soon for it to play out. And then there is the matter of guilt. After Anne Boleyn's execution, Henry ordered every image of her removed from royal residences. Her emblems were stripped away. No one who valued their safety ever heard him speak her name again. That kind of furious erasure doesn't suggest indifference. It suggests a man who could not bear to be reminded of what he had done. Jane, by contrast, was memorialized and celebrated. But it is worth asking whether Henry's grief for Jane was entirely about Jane herself, or whether it was also tangled up with relief. She had given him what no other wife had managed to give him. She had produced a healthy son and heir. She had, in dying in childbirth, removed herself before she could disappoint him or challenge him or give him reason to turn against her. In a deeply sad way, Jane's death may have preserved Henry's love for her more effectively than her survival ever could have. The traditional portrait of Jane Seymour, the gentle, selfless, almost saintly third wife, is not entirely wrong. She was genuinely kind. She was loyal to the people she cared about. She had real convictions that she acted on, even when it cost her. But she was also ambitious, calculating when she needed to be, and capable of stepping over a rival without visible remorse in order to take what she wanted. She was, in other words, a human being, no better and no worse, as one historian put it, than Anne Boleyn herself, who has so often been cast as the villain of this story, while Jane has been cast as the saint. The truth is messier and more interesting than either version. Jane Seymour lived a short life that intersected with one of the most turbulent periods in English history. She navigated it with more shrewdness than she has usually been given credit for, and she left behind a son who would one day rule England as Edward VI. That, in the end, is what Henry had always wanted, and Jane, quiet and plain and underestimated as she was, is the one who gave it to him.